what the recovery rates for creditors are, how many of them survive as new and reorganized firms, et cetera, right? So you'd run that trial, and you'd try to figure out the effects of the law on firms by comparing the treatment group, the ones that are subject to the new law, to the control group. Okay? So that would be the experimental approach. Right? So what I want to ask, just as a thought experiment, is whether a commitment to experimentalism would be universally desirable. Would that be a good thing? Leaving aside some of the technical issues. And I'm pretty skeptical, right? Just because, first of all, I think there's still a question of values, right? Even though this is a fairly sophisticated kind of theory, so it's functional because it's not saying you have to you have to call the experimental process any particular name or anything like that. You just have to run run this procedure that generates a particular kind of information. Right? So it's functional in that sense. It's not substantive, unlike the first two theories, because it's not saying you have to have laws that generate particular outcomes in any case. So it's not saying you need the same laws around the world. It's just saying you have to have an identical lawmaking process. Right? So it's procedural and functional, as opposed to substantive and sort of nominal. Right? So I think it's somewhat more sophisticated than where we started with the common law type of approach. But I still think there's room for philosophical disagreement here. So take, for example, what this means for the people in the treatment group. Right? You are using them as guinea pigs. Right? You're forcing them to become a means for generating information for the rest of society. Right? That is something that some people might take issue with, and some societies might take issue with, right? Especially if there's a risk of the treatment being harmful for them. You could say, well, we'll only do this for changes that we're reasonably confident will be successful, will be beneficial to everyone concerned, so then we don't have any ethical issues. We're not violating the maxim of do no harm. But if you're so sure it's a good idea, then why bother running the experiment? Why not implement it universally anyway? It seems like the only situation in which you'd want to do that is run this kind of experiment is when you're genuinely uncertain about the results and whether the status quo is better than the regime that would arise under the treatment. Right? But if even one of the subjects isn't uncertain and is pretty sure that this is bad for them, you run back into this normative question of, well, how do we justify imposing this treatment on someone who thinks it's harmful for them? So I do think that that sort of question of values is inevitable, right, once you move to an experimental regime. I think there are also questions about substitutes. There might be easier ways of getting at the information than an experiment. So if you're in Grenada and you're trying to decide whether to adopt this bankruptcy law, you could run an experiment. But if you've seen Trinidad do it just 5 years earlier and everything's working there, well, why not just go with their experience, right? So there's that. And as far as the complements are concerned, I think this is actually a particularly significant point because it takes a lot of expertise to run one of these experiments, to design and run and then interpret the results. And I don't think that every country in the world has the institutional capacity to do it, right? So how do you make sure the experiments aren't rigged to fail, right, by interest groups that really want to maintain the status quo? How do you prevent firms in the treatment group from rejecting the treatment by funneling their borrowing through firms that are actually in the control group, right, using them as shells and just boring through them, and they're basically evading the impact of the law? Who's going to determine whether the treatment group has been, whether the control group has been contaminated by the treatment, right? Because these firms are competing with one another. They're not completely independent. And there's going to be some sort of exercise of judgment that's entailed in determining whether this is truly a valid experiment. And then how are you going to do things like adjudicate disputes over whether the changes in the cost of credit, whether the differences between the groups are actually statistically significant? You're going to require lots of statisticians. You're going to be flying in experts in the United States, maybe from Yale Law School. And it's not clear that the game will be worth the candle, right? And that every country is actually, this will be the best solution for every country. So, I don't know if this is where we'll end up, but I would think that even this relatively appealing version of a universalist claim would still run into the same objections as as the first two claims that I discussed, right? So that's the argument in a nutshell. So, so what are the practical implications of all of this, right, if we reject universalism? First of all, the negative implications. I think there are some things that we'd have to stop doing, right? So for instance, the some of the activities of the Doing Business project that I described, going out and encouraging reforms, right, to fit their model. I have difficulty seeing the justification for that. The one-size-fits-all approach really, that can't be right. I don't think we should be forcing or strongly encouraging countries around the world to do that. There's also a sense in which we're encouraging those kinds of reforms indirectly. There's this organization called the Millennium Challenge Corporation, which is an aid agency that was set up by the Bush administration that is one of the sort of most innovative aid agencies around now. So it's actually doing some very interesting things, but one of the things it does is it conditions countries' eligibility for aid on them meeting certain objective criteria. So it's designed to take the subjectivity out of aid allocation. So if your scores are below a certain threshold on the corruption indicator or on inflation, you don't qualify, regardless of who your friends in Congress are. Right? One of the criteria they use, though, is the Doing Business Project's index for the ease of starting a business. Right? So what they're doing indirectly is encouraging countries to reduce or improve their scores on that index, right, in order to get the pot of gold, to hit the $300, $500, $600 million jackpot that is a grant from the Millennium Challenge Corporation. So there's a way in which these theories, these sort of theoretical claims about what counts as good law are being transformed into real pressure on, or at least very strong incentives on developing countries to reform their legal systems in particular ways. And that's why I think it's important to challenge the underlying premises. Right? So that's the negative part of the case. So what's to be done? Right? Is there anything that lawyers can do given what this sort of contextualist claim that I'm making, saying that the virtues, the right answer in any given situation will depend on the context, depend on local conditions, etc. That means, I think, that most of us in this room have relatively little to offer, at least in our capacity as lawyers, to the poor countries of the world, right? Because we know our own system, right? We don't know these different systems. So really, do we have to give up on the idea of us as lawyers changing things for the better? Right, this is the depressing part. When I teach my course on law and development, I start off with the optimistic story, right? And in the first week of class, when the students are shopping around, I can say, well, you know, there's all this literature that says law matters, lawyers can make a difference, you can change the world. By the end of the class, it's a different story. But we're still looking for the answer. But I do think there's some things we can do, and basically they involve supporting local decision-making, helping people in particular contexts who've got access to better information and who are more in touch with local values to make good decisions, right? We can do that by doing things like, well, ensuring that they're at least acting in good faith. That's where a lot of the initiatives around anti-corruption legislation, enforcing anti-corruption legislation, enforcing prohibitions on paying bribes to foreign public officials, that's where that comes in, right? Whether you're lobbying for changing the legislation itself or simply advising your clients not to pay bribes in these foreign countries, not only, even if they think they can get away with it, saying, well, you know, there are these other interests to be considered, especially interests of the host country. That's something. There's also sharing information, right? Just, you know, obviously publishing judicial decisions online, legislation and so forth. But for transactional lawyers, you know, the agreements you draft, right? Those are valuable documents. You know that because you've invested lots of billable hours in them. But they also, embedded in them is a lot of know-how and knowledge, and sharing those and making them publicly accessible, I think, is actually more valuable than you suspect, right? If after you've negotiated the concession agreement or the financing agreement, you just put it online, even if you redact the really sensitive parts, you know, just so that someone in a developing country can figure out what they should be negotiating for, right? Someone acting on behalf of a developing country government can figure out what they should be negotiating for without hiring Cleary Gottlieb, right? Sorry, Anna, you know, I think that makes a difference, right? So there's still that kind of information that can be shared. And so there are things like that. And then, of course, it's important to not forget the possibility of acting one case at a time, one client at a time, right, on the litigation front, or just encouraging your own clients on the transactional setting to do some good and to take into account these broader interests. That also matters too. So the claim is this talk wasn't meant to be completely pessimistic and skeptical. I am skeptical of the claim that we can change the world at a stroke.